An elderly black woman was walking through her neighborhood, a place she had called home for decades. With each step, she felt the warmth of the sun on her back and the slight rustle of a gentle breeze. She was dressed neatly, a modest outfit, and a small patterned bag slung over her shoulder, filled with groceries. Familiar faces waved to her from porches, children played nearby, and her steps were slow but steady, her pace a natural rhythm of someone who'd known these streets all her life. Then, without warning, a police car pulled up behind her, stopping abruptly. The tires squealed slightly, startling her and a few others on the street who turned to look. A young officer stepped out of the car, his expression tense, voice sharp, as he called out to her. She stopped, slightly confused, her hand instinctively tightening around her bag. His voice grew louder, commanding her to approach him, as though she were a suspect. She felt her heart quicken, but her face remained calm. This was not her first time being spoken to in that tone. She raised her hands slightly, her voice soft but firm, as she politely asked what was happening. She was used to respecting authority, but she also knew her rights. Her response seemed to irritate the officer. He took a step closer, his posture stiff, voice still raised. A few people began to gather, sensing the tension building. The officer began to accuse her of suspicious behavior, something about a report, though his words were vague, barely making sense. She tried to reason with him, explaining that she was only walking home after her grocery trip. Her tone was respectful, yet unyielding, her voice that of a woman who had seen many things in her life and wasn't about to back down over a misunderstanding. But the officer didn't seem to listen. His face showed irritation, his hands restless as they hovered near his holster. A small crowd was forming, people murmuring to each other, some pulling out their phones to record what was happening. The woman glanced at the onlookers, her expression tense but hopeful that someone might intervene, that someone might remind this officer that she had done nothing wrong. But no one stepped forward. Everyone seemed frozen, unsure of how to react, knowing all too well the risks of interfering in an altercation with law enforcement. The officer's voice rose another notch, ordering her to stop resisting, though she had done nothing but stand there, calmly explaining her situation. She tried again, telling him that she was just a block away from her home, that her son was expecting her soon. Her voice wavered slightly, but she held her ground, refusing to let him intimidate her. She was no stranger to this kind of encounter, having lived through decades where such moments were common. Her resilience was clear, but it seemed only to frustrate him further. In a swift, almost shocking movement, the officer lunged forward, grabbing her arm roughly. She gasped, the force nearly making her stumble, and pain shot through her shoulder. She protested, her voice now pleading, asking him to let her go. But he didn't stop. Instead, his grip tightened, his voice a growl as he repeated his command. The onlookers were now shouting, some pleading with the officer to release her, others demanding to know why he was treating her this way. And then, without any warning, he struck her. His fist came down hard against her face, a brutal punch that seemed to echo in the stunned silence that followed. She stumbled back, her frail body unable to bear the force of the blow. She clutched her face, a look of shock and pain flashing in her eyes as she tried to steady herself. Blood began to trickle down her cheek, and the crowd gasped, some of them visibly horrified, others too stunned to react. The air grew thick with tension. People started shouting louder, their anger and disbelief filling the street. Phones captured every moment, recording the image of this elderly woman, bruised and shaken, standing against an officer whose expression showed no remorse. She looked around, her gaze unfocused, and for a moment, she seemed to be searching the crowd, hoping that someone would come to her aid. As the officer moved to restrain her further, a woman in the crowd finally stepped forward, shouting that this was wrong, that she had seen everything and would not let this happen without consequence. A few others joined in, voices rising together in solidarity, demanding justice, demanding accountability. The woman, now trembling, raised her hand as if to calm them, her strength and dignity shining through, even as she stood there, visibly hurt, against a wall of authority that had shown her nothing but violence. A young man in the crowd reached out to her, offering his hand, and she took it, her grip weak but grateful. Together, they stood against the officer, a small act of resistance that seemed to spark courage in the others watching. The tension was palpable, a charged silence that spoke of anger, fear, and a deep unspoken bond among those who had witnessed the brutal treatment of this innocent woman. And as they stood there, side by side, waiting for someone to step forward and address this injustice, a new face appeared in the distance, someone who would change the course of what had just unfolded. But in that moment, all that could be felt was the weight of an injustice that had gone too far, and the resilient spirit of a woman who had endured more than anyone should ever have to endure. As the tension thickened and the crowd's voices rose in anger, a sleek, dark SUV pulled up quickly to the scene, tires crunching on the pavement as it came to an abrupt halt. The door swung open, and a tall, sharply dressed man stepped out, moving with an air of authority that was immediately recognizable to anyone familiar with local law enforcement. His suit was crisp, his badge visible as he adjusted his tie, and his face carried a seriousness that was hard to misinterpret. He moved quickly toward the cluster of people gathered on the sidewalk, his eyes narrowing as he took in the scene before him. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder as people recognized who he was. Some exchanged glances, surprise and disbelief spreading through them like a wave. This was not just any officer. It was the head of the police department, a man known for his firm stance on justice and his reputation for demanding accountability within his ranks. But few knew that this was also the son of the woman who now stood injured and shaken, her face marked with the harsh impact of the officer's fist. As he approached, his gaze fell on his mother, and for a split second, the cold professionalism that defined him cracked, revealing a glimpse of raw emotion. Shock, concern, and a deep-seated anger flickered in his eyes, though he quickly masked it, drawing himself up to his full height. He exuded a composed authority that only intensified the silence that now fell over the crowd. His mother's face lit up in relief upon seeing him, her hand reaching out, and he crossed the remaining distance between them in a few quick strides. He gently placed his hand on her shoulder, his touch both protective and reassuring. "Mom," he murmured softly, checking her face, his eyes scanning the bruise already forming on her cheek, the blood that still glistened from the corner of her lip. She gave a faint nod, her lips parting in a small, grateful smile, though the pain in her eyes was clear. For a moment, they shared a quiet understanding, a bond that ran deeper than any words could express. She knew her son well enough to see the storm brewing beneath his calm exterior, yet she said nothing, trusting him to handle what needed to be done. He turned his attention to the young officer, who was now visibly pale, eyes wide with a realization of the gravity of what he had just done. The crowd watched, holding their breath, as the head of the department faced the man who had just assaulted his mother. The officer stammered slightly, attempting to explain, but his voice faltered under the weight of his superior's penetrating gaze. The head of the department spoke slowly, each word weighted with controlled intensity. "Explain yourself," he said, his voice low but firm, laced with an authority that brooked no argument. He waited, his eyes fixed on the officer, who fumbled to come up with a response. The officer tried to justify his actions, mumbling about suspicious behavior and non-compliance. His words stumbled over each other, his voice betraying the anxiety that had overtaken him, now that he realized the woman he had hurt was not just any civilian, but the mother of his superior. The head of the department listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable, though his fists were clenched tightly by his sides. His silence only heightened the tension, leaving the officer visibly unnerved. Once the officer finished, he took a step closer, his voice lowering, though every word was clear and unyielding. "This is how you protect our community?" he asked, his tone sharp and steady. "An unarmed elderly woman? My mother?" The words hung in the air, heavy with the unspoken fury of a son confronting the man who had dared to hurt the most important person in his life. The officer's face drained of color as the implications of his actions fully settled in. He glanced around at the crowd, who stood in silent solidarity, watching as their police chief held one of his own accountable, not as a son seeking vengeance, but as a leader demanding justice. The air was thick with tension, and no one dared to move, each person caught in the gravity of the moment. Seeing the fear in the officer's eyes, the head of the department took a deep breath, regaining his composure. He turned back to his mother, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. "Mom, let me take care of this," he whispered softly, his voice tinged with a tenderness that cut through the hard exterior he wore in front of his officers and the community. She nodded, her trust in him unwavering, and he helped her sit on a nearby bench, reassuring her with a quiet confidence that everything would be all right. Then he turned back to the officer, his expression hardening once more. The crowd watched in respectful silence as he made it clear that there would be consequences. The officer, now visibly shaking, took a step back, trying to avoid his superior's intense gaze. "Effective immediately. You are relieved of duty pending a full investigation," he announced, his voice echoing with authority and finality. "Your badge and weapon now." The officer's hands shook as he complied, handing over his badge and weapon, his face flushed with humiliation and fear. The head of the department took them, a look of barely restrained anger still in his eyes. He glanced at the crowd, who looked back at him with expressions of respect and admiration, seeing in him not only a son standing up for his mother, but a leader standing up for justice. Without another word, he gestured for two other officers who had arrived on the scene to escort the now suspended officer away. As they led him toward their car, the crowd murmured quietly, some expressing relief, others quietly celebrating the fact that justice, for once, was being pursued openly and without hesitation. He stood there for a moment, watching as the officer was taken away, his expression firm but distant, a man with the weight of both personal and professional duty resting heavily on his shoulders. Once the officer was out of sight, he returned to his mother, kneeling beside her and gently taking her hand. She smiled at him, her face still marked by the ordeal she'd been through, but there was a glimmer of pride in her eyes. He brushed a tear from her cheek, his fingers soft against her bruised skin, and they sat there quietly, mother and son, knowing that despite the trauma, they had faced it together, and justice was being served. The crowd slowly began to disperse, but the memory of what they had witnessed, the unwavering stand of a man torn between duty and love, would remain etched in their minds long after. As the crowd gradually dispersed, the head of the department remained by his mother's side, his hand resting gently on hers. He could feel the slight tremble in her fingers, a silent testament to the ordeal she had just endured. Her eyes, though still filled with pain, held a steady calm, as if she wanted to reassure him, to tell him that she was all right. But he knew better. He knew that beneath her strength, this experience had left a mark that words alone couldn't erase. After a moment, he straightened, turning his attention back to the scene around them. The few remaining officers nearby stood stiffly, their eyes flicking nervously between him and the remnants of the crowd. They had seen their superior react, not as a detached official, but as a son, and this shift in their perception of him seemed to unnerve them. The weight of his authority was now unmistakable, as was the message he had sent, that no one, not even those in uniform, was above accountability. One officer, a veteran of the department, hesitated before stepping forward, clearly uneasy, but compelled to speak. He cleared his throat. "Sir, I don't think any of us knew." His voice trailed off as he struggled to find the right words, his usual confidence subdued by the weight of the moment. The head of the department looked at him, his gaze steady but unreadable. "Not knowing doesn't excuse anyone," he replied quietly, his tone firm. "Our duty is to protect the people, not to harm them." His words hung in the air, heavy and deliberate, leaving no room for excuses. The veteran officer nodded, visibly humbled, his eyes lowering as he muttered a quiet apology. The silence that followed was thick, the kind that follows a reckoning, a shift in dynamics that couldn't be ignored. The head of the department took a deep breath, trying to push down the emotions simmering just beneath the surface. He glanced back at his mother, seeing her watching him with a mixture of pride and sorrow. She knew the path he had chosen was not an easy one, and moments like this would demand sacrifices he hadn't anticipated. She could see the exhaustion in his eyes, the weight of duty pressing down on him, yet she said nothing, knowing that he had to bear it alone. He turned his attention back to the remaining officers, his voice growing sharper, more authoritative. "I want a full report on what happened here," he said, his tone leaving no room for hesitation. "Every detail, from the initial call to the officers' actions." He scanned their faces, watching as they nodded, each one understanding that they were now on notice, that their actions, or inaction, would no longer go unchecked. His gaze lingered, as if weighing their character, their commitment to the values they had sworn to uphold. One of the junior officers looked visibly nervous, shifting uncomfortably under the piercing gaze of his superior. Finally, the young man spoke up, his voice shaking slightly. "Sir, we didn't intervene. We saw what was happening, but, he's one of us. It's hard to..." The head of the department's jaw tightened as he listened, his eyes narrowing as the young officer struggled to explain himself. When the young man finished, he paused, letting the weight of the words settle. "One of us," he repeated, his voice low but intense. "When someone in uniform breaks the very principles we stand for, they are no longer one of us. They become a danger to the community and to everything we're supposed to represent." The young officer swallowed, his face turning pale as the reality of his superior's words sank in. This wasn't just a reprimand. It was a stark reminder of the responsibility that came with wearing the badge. The head of the department continued, his gaze shifting to the other officers. If you see an injustice and you do nothing, you are complicit. Remember that. Every single one of you is accountable for what happens out here. It's not about loyalty to each other. It's about loyalty to the truth, to the people we serve. The officers nodded, their expressions somber as they took in the gravity of his words. They had seen their leader's humanity today, but also his unyielding resolve. They understood now that he would demand the same from them, that there would be no tolerance for complacency or excuses. It was a sobering realization, and as they stood there, each one felt the weight of responsibility settle more heavily on their shoulders. The head of the department turned away, glancing back at his mother. She gave him a slight nod, a silent acknowledgement of what he had just done. She understood that he had to carry this burden alone, that in his role, he couldn't afford to show vulnerability. But she also knew that beneath the stern exterior was her son, a man torn between the demands of his position and the fierce love that had driven him to stand up for her. A few members of the community had stayed behind, watching quietly, their faces a mix of relief and respect. They knew that justice, for once, was not just a word, but a promise being fulfilled in front of them. The head of the department acknowledged them with a slight nod, a gesture that spoke volumes without words. He knew that they were watching, that they would hold him accountable as much as he held his officers to their duty. As he walked back toward his mother, the weight of the moment settled upon him fully. He reached her, his shoulders slightly slumped, the adrenaline from the confrontation now replaced by an overwhelming exhaustion. She looked up at him, her gaze soft, yet unwavering, and placed a gentle hand on his cheek, a silent reminder that no matter how difficult the path, he was not alone. He took her hand, pressing it to his heart for a brief moment before helping her to her feet. Together, they began to walk away from the scene, the gravity of what had just transpired lingering in the air like a distant echo. The officers and onlookers watched them go, a mother and son bound by love, justice, and a resilience that neither time nor adversity could break. In that walk, side by side, they shared an unspoken understanding, a unity that went beyond words. They knew that there would be more battles ahead, more moments that would test their strength and resolve. But for now, as they walked together, they knew that they had done what was right, and that, in itself, was a victory. The next day, the department buzzed with an intensity that hadn't been felt in years. Word of the incident had spread like wildfire, and nearly everyone was talking about it. Officers in the break room murmured in low voices, exchanging glances as they glanced over at the closed door of the head office. Some looked troubled, while others seemed almost wary, as if realizing that they were now in uncharted territory. The head of the department, seated at his desk, looked over the preliminary reports, his expression set in a hard, unyielding line. He had called for a full investigation, and he was determined to see it through, regardless of where the evidence led. The report detailed every aspect of the incident: the officer's arrival, the interaction with his mother, the escalation, and ultimately, the assault. He read each word carefully, his eyes narrowing as he reached the section where the officer claimed he felt threatened by her non-compliance. His jaw tightened. Threatened? By a frail, elderly woman carrying a bag of groceries? The claim was almost laughable if it weren't so tragic. A knock at his door interrupted his thoughts. He looked up to see the department's internal affairs officer, a sharp-eyed woman with a no-nonsense demeanor. She stepped in, carrying a stack of files, her expression calm but focused. She took a seat across from him, placing the files on his desk with a decisive thud. "We've compiled the witness statements, as well as the footage from the scene," she said, her tone professional, yet sympathetic. She had heard the rumors. Everyone had. But she kept her personal feelings under control, knowing that in this situation, objectivity was paramount. He nodded, reaching for the files, his fingers tightening slightly as he flipped through them. The witness statements were clear and consistent. They described his mother as calm, polite, cooperative. Not a single witness had seen any hint of resistance. Instead, they had all described the officer's behavior as aggressive, unprovoked, and, most damningly, unnecessary. One statement caught his eye, a young woman who had witnessed the entire altercation. She described how his mother had repeatedly asked the officer to explain why she was being stopped, how she had complied with his commands, yet still been treated with hostility. The woman had included details about the officer's tone, how he had raised his voice, and how she had seen fear in his mother's eyes just before he struck her. The head of the department felt a surge of anger rise within him, but he forced it back down, keeping his face impassive. He couldn't afford to let emotions cloud his judgment. This was no longer just about what had happened to his mother. This was about the integrity of the entire department and the trust they had lost with the community they served. He knew that if he didn't address this with absolute transparency, it would not only destroy his credibility, but also fuel the deep-seated distrust many in the community already felt toward law enforcement. The internal affairs officer cleared her throat. "There's one more piece of evidence," she said, opening another file. "Body camera footage." Her expression was grim as she handed him the tablet, the screen already displaying the frozen image of the encounter. He took a deep breath before pressing play, bracing himself as the footage began. The image was clear, the sound sharp, and within moments, he saw his mother's face on the screen, her expression calm, though tinged with confusion. He watched as the officer barked orders at her, his tone aggressive from the very beginning. She was calm, cooperative, repeatedly asking him to explain, her hands visible, her posture relaxed. But his voice only grew harsher, filled with a tone that was unmistakably hostile. And then, as he watched the officer strike his mother, he felt a wave of fury threaten to break through his restraint. He paused the footage, his hand gripping the edge of the desk tightly, his knuckles white. But he took a deep breath, reminding himself that he was here as a professional, as a leader. He couldn't let this be about personal vengeance. It had to be about justice. He glanced up at the internal affairs officer, who was watching him carefully. "We'll proceed with immediate disciplinary action," he said, his voice steady but firm. "He'll face charges: assault, abuse of power, violation of protocol." She nodded, her expression one of quiet agreement. "We'll need a public statement," she added, her voice gentle but direct. "The community needs to hear this from you." He knew she was right. This wasn't something that could be handled behind closed doors. The people needed to see that the department was taking responsibility, that they weren't hiding behind procedures or protecting one of their own. He owed it to them. More than that, he owed it to his mother. The following afternoon, a press conference was held. Reporters filled the room, their cameras trained on the podium where the head of the department would soon stand. The atmosphere was tense, charged with a mix of anticipation and skepticism. Many of those present had covered similar incidents before, each time hoping for transparency, often only to be met with vague statements and empty promises. But today felt different. The community knew who the victim was, knew the connection that had forced this story into the light, and they wanted answers. He stepped up to the podium, his face composed, his demeanor as steady as ever. But those who looked closely could see a glint of something deeper in his eyes, a determination that went beyond protocol, a commitment that was as personal as it was professional. He began by recounting the facts, detailing the incident with the clarity and precision of a man who had reviewed every moment of the encounter. He didn't shy away from the truth. He described the officer's actions, the escalation, and the unnecessary force used against an unarmed elderly woman. He made it clear that this was not just an isolated incident, but part of a larger issue that needed addressing within the department. "Effective immediately," he said, his voice carrying across the room. "The officer involved has been suspended without pay, pending criminal charges and an internal investigation. We are committed to holding him accountable to the fullest extent of the law." The room was silent as he continued, his voice growing softer but more resolute. "This incident has made one thing abundantly clear. The relationship between law enforcement and the community is fragile. It's built on trust, a trust that we are responsible for upholding. When that trust is broken, it is our duty to restore it, not through words, but through actions." Reporters' hands shot up as he finished, questions filling the air. He answered each one patiently, carefully, ensuring that no details were left unclear. He knew that transparency was the only path forward, that if he wanted to heal the rift between the department and the community, he had to be open, honest, and, most importantly, accountable. As he stepped away from the podium, a sense of resolution filled him. He knew there would be backlash from some within the department, those who felt loyalty to the badge above all else. But he also knew that change was never easy, and that sometimes the hardest path was the one most worth taking. And as he walked back through the throngs of people, he felt, for the first time, a sense of clarity, a sense that he was finally doing what he had always set out to do: serve and protect, with honesty and integrity. In the weeks that followed, life in the community took on a different rhythm. The story of what had happened to the elderly woman and her son's response reverberated through every corner of the city. Conversations bubbled up in grocery store lines, at community gatherings, and in local barbershops. People spoke not only of the injustice, but also of the unexpected moment of accountability, the powerful stand the head of the police department had taken, and the way he had held one of his own to the same standards he demanded of the public. At the center of it all, the elderly woman found herself navigating both recovery and an unexpected spotlight. People she barely knew would stop her on the street, offering words of sympathy, encouragement, and admiration. Children in the neighborhood would bring her flowers, shyly handing her small bouquets as if to bring her healing in their own way. Parents would look at her with respect, recognizing her as not just a victim, but as a symbol of strength, a woman who had endured, who had faced down violence and pain with dignity. Her son visited her often, sometimes bringing her small things he knew would make her smile: her favorite tea, a magazine she liked, or just fresh fruit from the farmer's market. He made sure to sit with her, to listen to her thoughts, and to share his own struggles as they worked through the aftermath together. Their conversations were often quiet, her hand resting over his, her words laced with wisdom she had gained from a lifetime of resilience. "You did what was right," she would tell him, her voice gentle but firm. "You remembered where you came from. That's something no uniform can ever take away." As the investigation continued within the department, he found himself confronting difficult truths about the institution he had dedicated his life to. He sat in on meeting after meeting, looking at statistics, reports, and hearing stories from officers who had both supported and struggled with the changes he was pushing forward. He spent time with younger officers, listening to their concerns, understanding their fear of repercussions if they intervened in situations where they saw injustice within their ranks. He knew that rebuilding trust wasn't something that could be done with policies alone. It required a shift in culture, a willingness to hold each other accountable in real time, to set aside the blue wall that so often kept wrongdoings hidden. But as challenging as the process was, he saw small glimmers of progress. A few officers, once reluctant, began stepping forward, sharing their thoughts openly in training sessions he'd initiated. They discussed scenarios, difficult situations they'd faced, the complexity of their roles, and the weight of the badge. Together, they examined the role of empathy, integrity, and the fundamental responsibility they carried to protect, not to intimidate. He witnessed a growing openness among his team, a willingness to confront the flaws within their system and seek a better way forward. For his mother, healing was slower but steady. Her physical wounds healed with time, though the emotional scars took longer to fade. She attended a few community meetings at her son's encouragement, sharing her experience with others, using her story to give a voice to those who had faced similar treatment but had never been heard. People listened to her with rapt attention, their faces a mix of anger, sadness, and respect. She became a soft-spoken yet powerful advocate for those who felt unseen, lending her voice to conversations on accountability and fairness. One evening, a neighborhood gathering was held in her honor, organized by community members who wanted to show their support and appreciation. She arrived at the small park where the event was held, her son guiding her through the crowd as people clapped, their smiles warm and welcoming. Children ran around, and elders approached her with kind words, some with tears in their eyes. It was a celebration of resilience, a recognition of what she had endured and overcome. And as she stood there, looking at the faces of those around her, she felt a warmth that reached deep within her, a sense of belonging that reassured her she was not alone in her journey. Her son took the stage for a brief moment, his voice carrying over the crowd. He thanked everyone for their support, acknowledging the pain that had brought them together, but also the strength that had emerged from it. "We still have a long way to go," he admitted, his voice solemn. "But with all of you by our side, I know that change is possible. Real, lasting change. And it starts here, with each of us, together." As the crowd cheered, he looked down at his mother, who was watching him with pride in her eyes. She nodded, a small smile playing on her lips as if to say, "You're doing just fine." And in that moment, he felt a deep sense of peace, a reassurance that the difficult path he had chosen was the right one. Over time, the changes he implemented took root in the department. New training protocols were introduced, focusing on de-escalation, empathy, and community engagement. Officers were required to participate in regular discussions and training sessions, where they would learn not only from experts, but also from community members who shared their perspectives and experiences. The elderly woman, along with others, became a regular speaker in these sessions, her presence reminding the officers of the faces behind their duties, the lives they touched with each encounter. The shift was gradual, and there were challenges along the way. Some officers left, unwilling to embrace the new standards, but those who remained grew stronger, more united in their purpose. They understood that their role was no longer just about enforcing laws, but about building bridges, earning the trust of the community, and living up to the values they had sworn to uphold. The elderly woman watched these changes with a quiet pride, knowing that her son's commitment to justice had made a difference, not only for her, but for countless others who might never face the same injustice she had endured. In the end, the incident that had caused such pain became a catalyst for transformation. The elderly woman and her son continued their journey, side by side, their bond only strengthened by what they had faced together. And as they walked through their community, people would greet them with nods, waves, and words of gratitude, recognizing in them a symbol of resilience, justice, and hope. The mother and son had become more than just figures of a moment. They were symbols of a community's renewed faith in itself and in the possibility of real change. People saw in them not just survivors of an injustice, but leaders of a movement that had sparked the courage to demand fairness, not only in law enforcement, but in every interaction within their society. In the months that followed, more gatherings took place. The elderly woman and her son were often invited to speak at town halls, churches, and community centers, where they shared their journey and the lessons learned. Her son spoke of accountability from within, and she spoke of strength from within the community. Their voices encouraged open dialogue between civilians and officers, which fostered understanding, respect, and even camaraderie, where there had once been fear and resentment. Slowly, the presence of officers in neighborhoods began to feel different. Children who used to avoid the sight of a patrol car now watched with curiosity and even waved, receiving waves in return. Officers walked the streets, joining local events, helping with neighborhood initiatives, and spending time learning the stories of the people they served. A once divided community began to feel united by a shared commitment to safety and mutual respect. Meanwhile, the elderly woman's life began to return to a new normal. Though she would always carry the memory of that day, she refused to let it define her or take away her spirit. She continued to be an active part of her neighborhood, hosting small gatherings at her home, sharing meals and laughter with friends and neighbors who had become like family. People often looked to her as a figure of quiet strength, a reminder that justice was both possible and necessary, a standard to be upheld not only by those in uniform, but by every member of the community. Her son, too, found a renewed sense of purpose. His dedication to his role had deepened, not merely as an enforcer of law, but as a guardian of equity and trust. His reputation grew as a leader who wouldn't tolerate misconduct, who valued transparency, and who held himself and his team to the highest standards. The respect he had earned was not from a title, but from his actions, and he became a mentor to younger officers, instilling in them the ideals of honor and accountability that had come to define him. One evening, after another community event, he and his mother walked home together, the street lamps casting soft shadows as they strolled through the familiar streets. They spoke quietly, exchanging thoughts about the people they had met, the progress they had seen, and the challenges that lay ahead. She paused at one point, looking at him with a wisdom that years had given her, and placed a hand gently on his arm. "You've done well," she said softly, her voice filled with both pride and affection. I'm proud of the man you've become, proud of the way you remember who you are and where you come from, even when the path isn't easy." He looked down at her, a faint smile touching his lips as he absorbed her words. "I learned from you," he replied. "I learned that strength doesn't come from power or titles. It comes from doing what's right, even when no one's watching." They continued their walk in companionable silence, each lost in their thoughts, yet comforted by each other's presence. They knew the journey would continue, that there would always be work to be done, but they were no longer alone. The community had found its voice, the officers had found their purpose, and together they had begun to build something that would outlast any single moment or act of injustice. In the end, it wasn't just about one act of accountability or one family's resilience. It was about the transformation that took root because of them. And as they reached her doorstep, they shared a final look, one that held a lifetime of love, respect, and shared determination. For in each other, they saw not only a mother and son, but partners in the pursuit of a world where justice and compassion lived side by side. And in that small, quiet moment, they understood that they had already made a difference, one that would ripple outward, carrying hope and change far beyond the limits of their community.